Hi everyone, it's Ardith, and today I'm on the Jillian Vance design blog with a Pinterest-inspired Christmas card in a clean, modern style. It has a number of components, and the first one is mistletoe. I'm using some green Catherine Pooler mini inks to color my white cardstock. I love using the minis for this. They're the perfect size for creating wide stripes that almost blend when you use colors that are closer together on the color wheel. I even overlap some of them a bit to create more tones of green. If you like to use this technique to color your cardstock a lot, like I do, I definitely recommend getting the reinkers for your ink pads. These subtle stripes will add some interest to the mistletoe leaves without being too crazy. When I got to the end, I felt like the garden green was too much of a contrast with the darker shades, so I narrowed that big stripe with other colors, and then I finally went over it a few times to intensify the color. The next step was to cut as much Merry Mistletoe out of this panel as I could get. I taped the 3 mistletoe dies together as closely as possible, and I ran them through my Gemini Junior twice. Then I was able to get a few more of the smallest die cut out of the remaining bits. This gave me a nice bunch of mistletoe leaves. The next component was the berries. I'm using the same inking method, but this time I'm using a scrap strip of cardstock from my drawer, where I keep white pieces like this just for this purpose. This time I'm using Samba and Tutti Frutti, which are very bright orangey reds that will really pop from my green leaves. The die in the Merry Mistletoe set cuts 6 berries at a time, and it's pretty small, so I didn't need to ink up too much paper. The final inking component is my navy blue background, and this is a great example of why I need to have reinkers on hand. This ink pad is getting dry, so you can see that as well as swiping it across the white cardstock, I'm pouncing and twisting and basically using any method I can think of that will put some ink down on the paper. Look at it now and you can see that it's not perfectly smooth. And I'll remind you at the final photo to think back to this. You'll be amazed at how smoothly it dries. Next, I blended some black soot Distress Oxide ink around the edges to deepen the color a bit, and I wish I hadn't. Because of the chalky texture of the Oxide ink, it really didn't deepen it much at all, and I really wasn't happy with it. I think that regular Distress ink would have been better, or even Catherine's Queen for a Day, which is a deep purple. If you're wondering why I didn't use Catherine's Midnight ink, it's because it's archival, so it's a different type of ink, and I find I don't really get a good blend with it in situations like this. Anyway, in the end, the effect of the Oxide ink was pretty subtle, and some of it was trimmed off, so while I didn't hate the background panel, I would definitely do it differently next time. The next component was my white letters. Again, I used a scrap strip from my drawer, and I cut out the letters for Noel from the headline type alphabet dies. I cut 3 of each so I can stack them up for some dimension. I lined the letters up in 3 rows, and I added liquid glue to the top 2 of each letter, and then I stacked all 3 together and I placed an acrylic block down to hold everything in place while the glue dried. So now I've finally got all my components inked and cut, and it's time to start assembling the card. Here's the navy panel trimmed with the largest stitch dot rectangle. I'm placing it on my metal Make Art workstation and holding it in place with the magnets. I love this metal surface and its magnetic ruler, especially for lining up letters so they'll be straight. Now, it would have been easier if I had worked top to bottom, but the ruler even held in place over the bottom stacked up letters when it was time for me to put the top letters in place. I used liquid glue for these, and I put the acrylic block on top to hold them. Next, it was time to place the mistletoe around the sentiment. I worked my way around, trying to fill in as much of the navy blue space as possible. I'm loving how these green leaves really pop from the dark background. When I was happy with the arrangement, I glued everything down with liquid glue, and I even had some of the leaves extending up over the letters a little. Then it was time to place the berries. To add a little variety, I used the period die from the headline type alphabet set, and I cut 6 slightly larger berries. Before I went any further, I used some sharp scissors to trim the excess of the mistletoe from the edges. You could use your paper trimmer for this if you want. Then I placed the larger berries first, and I filled in the rest with smaller berries. I used a jewel picker and a craft pick for placement, aiming for good coverage over my scene, and including a couple right on the letters. And then I used liquid glue to glue them all down. For some shine, I used some Nuvo crystal glaze on the berries. and I discovered that I hadn't glued one of them down. So I carefully moved it with my craft pick, put some glue down on the background, and ever so carefully moved it back into place. I probably should have waited for the crystal glaze to dry, but it worked out for me this time. And now it's time for me to remind you to look at how smooth that navy background is. These inks are amazing for this. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm loving how these colors pop from the dark background. And of course you could use colored cardstock instead of making your own, but I do think that the stripes on the leaves add some interest. Product links are below in the description and also on my blog. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.